Hi, kids. This is Mrs. Ortlieb again. We are going to finish up our evolution unit by talking about the evidence of evolution. So, just to recap, what is evolution? We know that evolution is change over time. So, species change over long periods of time. And there's some exceptions to this. You have bacteria and insects. Anything that reproduces very quickly, like bacteria, remember that they reproduce every 20 minutes, and insects can reproduce in a few days. Anything that has a very short lifespan and makes a lot of offspring, you will see evolution happen more quickly in those species. The driving force of evolution is environmental change. So, if the environment is not changing very much, then you will not see evolution taking place in species. So, those species are going to look very similar to their ancestors. One example of this is oceans. They're changing dramatically now, but you can look at fossil evidence of many organisms that currently live in the ocean, and they look very similar to their ancestors that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. And scientists have tested and confirmed this in many different ways. And so, although it's not a law, it's still a theory, but there's a large amount of evidence that supports the theory of evolution. Okay, more so than any other theory. Now, let's take a look at the evidence. So, let's talk about the Earth. Now, just so you know, evidence is going to come from all different realms of science: chemistry, biology, earth science, physics. And so, going back to a little bit to earth science, you learned about the age of the Earth. And according to radioactive dating, estimating the erosion rate of rocks, scientists know that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. And so, what is the evidence that we have foreseeing evolution taking place? Okay, well, because of we understand earth science and we understand the formation of rock and land masses, we understand that it happens in layers. So it's pretty much you can see the fossil record in many areas around the world, and the understanding is that the oldest fossils are going to be found at the bottom, okay, and the youngest fossils will be found at the top. So it is like a visual record here. Anything found millions and millions of years ago will be found near the bottom. And they're still finding fossils today all over the world, okay, even on Long Island. So any remains of organisms found in layers of rock are known as fossils, and this is the fossil record. Now, 3 billion years ago, you have your one-celled organisms, okay? Mainly bacteria. These are the organisms that are first found here on Earth. 1 billion years ago, you start to see multicellular organisms, so more than one cell. About 400, 500 million years ago, you start to see marine and land plants appear. 300 million years ago, reptiles evolved. Now, one thing to understand about plants is they did change the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis. They started to produce oxygen, and that completely changed what animals were able to survive. 100 million years ago, the dinosaurs flourished. 65 million years ago, mammals evolved. 400,000 years ago, you have modern humans. And then, well, this is a little old, but 43 years ago, I came around. So let's continue. Here is some fossils. You have two different species here. Okay, Homo sapien is on the right and Neanderthal is on the left. And you can clearly see that we are related. We share many anatomical structures, our bone structure. There's a couple differences, Neanderthals are shorter in stature. Their skulls were actually a lot larger than ours, and their brain size was larger. But for some reason, we outsurvived this species. We did interbreed. There is genetic evidence that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals breed. They did breed, but they did not survive. Okay, you don't find any Neanderthals around today. So although it's interesting and scientists are still trying to figure this out, although they had bigger brains, for some reason we had an advantage. They think there's lots of theories about this. One of them is they think that we were better able to live in groups and that gave us an advantage in survival. Um, Another theory is that we had a greater sense of smell, and that helped us to figure out who was family and who was related to us, and maybe help us to you know, not eat rotten food and be able to figure out what was safe. So there are all kinds of theories that scientists are still studying and trying to understand why is it that our species survived and Homo sapiens, Neanderthals did not. But this is what artist rendition of Neanderthals, what they would look like. And this is what you would look like if they survived today, but they didn't. So let's talk about fossil evidence. Fossil evidence is one of the main sources of evidence, or one of the first sources of evidence of evolution. And we still use fossil evidence today. This shows you a picture of the evolution of the horse. You can see from the picture that it is a dramatic evolution. Horses evolved on land, and we know that the land environment changed very dramatically. So horses look like little dogs at one point, and they grew to the size of the horses we have today. One of the dramatic changes that you see in the horse evolution is their foot structure. So they actually had toes like we did, and they evolved into having hooves. So this gave them some kind of advantage in their survival, and that's why you see all horse species that have these hooves. So looking at fossil evidence shows you that change over time, and this took a very long time. You can look at other species and compare their fossils, their bone anatomy as well. And this will tell you that there is a relationship. So when you share similar bone structure, and it's hard to look at an animal and see that, you have to do it internally. So when you compare human, cat, whale, and bat, you can see that we share similar bone structures. So we all have a humerus, an ulna, and a radius. We have metacarpals. We all have digits. And so that shows you, or that suggests that there was a common ancestor. Okay, so it means that we're related, that we're descended from a common ancestor. All right, so these are known as homologous structures. And homologous structures, homo means same. So this means that we share similar structures, although they're used for different functions. Okay. Now it denotes a common ancestor, so it means we share, we are descended from a common ancestor. Okay, here's some more pictures just showing you that same idea there. Vestigial structures are actually structures that we still inherit. They don't have a function anymore, so they're present in modern species, and they were once functional. And there are a couple examples of these. These are interesting, like the appendix, and we talked about this when we learned about the digestive system. So although it really doesn't have a function in us anymore, it is a structure that we inherit. And the theory is that this was perhaps used to break down cellulose or some plant material, because that's what our diet was mostly based on, a long time ago. And we still inherit that. Here's some more interesting vestigial structures: ear muscles. So although we, don't really use our ears like cats and other animals do when they hear a predator, and they can, use it to protect themselves. They can hear better by moving their ear muscles. We still inherit this muscle here. So that suggests that we share a common ancestor with other species that have the same muscle structure. Our wisdom teeth, we still inherit this structure, even though in some cases some people's don't even come out anymore, and we usually remove them now. This one's a cool one. This is called a nictitating eye membrane. So you see this a lot in a reptile species in birds, cats too. It's this protective membrane, and you can see that we don't really have one, but you can see the remnants of it in the corner of your eye. So it's some vestigial structure that we inherited. And our tailbone suggests that in one point our ancestors had tails, and we still inherit this, even though it's no longer useful. Male nipples, this is an interesting one. So, although males don't breastfeed, it just shows that we are related to other animals that do. Okay, and I thought you guys could relate to this one. That's right, dear. Our ancestors had tails. So, if you have a phone like this at home, it's like a fossil. So, embryology is another science that gives a lot of support to the theory of evolution. If you study embryos of organisms, you'll see that many of them look very similar early in their embryonic development. So, you really wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a fish, a rabbit, or a gorilla when you have early embryos. And as they develop, they start to look different. But having those similar structures early on in their development suggests that again we share a common ancestor. So all embryos, including ours, have gill slits and tails, and we lose them as we continue our development. So early stages of development have similar structures. Now, some of the best evidence for evolution we have been able to obtain in the last 30 years, 40 years now, with DNA. DNA analysis. So we didn't get a chance to really get into this year because of of the current situation, but we would have learned about some techniques that allow us to look into the DNA of different organisms and compare them. So there's a couple techniques that you can use. One is called gel electrophoresis. This is a technique where you take samples of DNA, you cut them with enzymes, and you put them on a gel, and it separates the DNA by size. And you might have seen this technique being used in a lot of crime shows or movies. And basically, what it allows you to do is it creates a pattern, and the more of these little fragments that species share, the more related they are. Okay, and that makes sense because just like your brother and sister, you're obviously you share 50% of the DNA with your brother and sister. It means you're more related. And scientists have been using this to confirm ideas about who's related and which organisms are not. And in some cases, things have been disproved. So certain animals can look alike, but when you look at their DNA, they may not share much DNA, which suggests that they're not very related. Okay. So, along with DNA, you can also compare proteins and amino acids. So that goes with the DNA because DNA codes for protein. So if you're going to share more DNA, then you will also share more protein. So comparing amino acid sequences, the more amino acids you have in common, the more related the organisms will be. Okay, so this is just an example. Here you have humans, and these are the amino acids. So lysine, glutamine, histine, isoleucine. And if you compare them, you'll see that when it comes to humans, chimpanzees and humans share more amino acid sequences. So the more amino acids you share in a protein, the more related you are. The more proteins you share, the more related you are. All right. Um, Now, DNA evidence, just going back to that, organisms that have a common ancestor are going to have similar DNA and proteins. So the more related you are, the more DNA and proteins you share. For example, humans and chimpanzees, they share 98% of their DNA. They share a common ancestor about 5 million years ago. So their DNA is very similar. Okay. And um, the further the less related you are, the less DNA you share. But even bacteria, we share some DNA with them, which suggests that we are all related. We all share some amount of DNA because we all come from some common ancestor. Okay, so that's it for this slideshow. So take a look at this, review it, and try the questions on Castle Learning. All right, good luck.